What would you do if you spent years training to become an immovable statue, only to face a moment where staying silent could mean watching someone suffer? For one royal guard at Palace, that impossible choice became reality on a busy Tuesday afternoon in London. The centuries-old tradition of royal guard discipline was about to meet modern-day human compassion in a way that would leave thousands of witnesses speechless and change one man's life forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Palace as guard James adjusted his iconic red tunic one final time. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, long enough to know that this day would test every ounce of his legendary discipline. The weather forecast promised crowds, and crowds always meant challenges. James had earned his position through months of grueling training at the Infantry Training Center. Every morning, he had practiced standing motionless for hours, learning to ignore pain, discomfort, and distraction. The instructors had drilled into him the sacred rules: never speak unless directly addressed by a superior officer, never break formation, never acknowledge the public, and never, under any circumstances, abandon your post. These weren't just rules to James. They were a code of honor passed down through generations of guards who had protected British royalty through wars, celebrations, and countless ordinary days. His grandfather had been a guard during World War II, standing watch even as bombs fell on London. His father had served during the turbulent 1980s, maintaining composure through protests and political upheaval. The family understood that being a royal guard meant more than wearing a uniform. It meant becoming a living symbol of British tradition and unwavering duty. As James took his position outside the palace gates, the familiar weight of his bearskin hat settled on his shoulders. The tourists hadn't arrived in full force yet, but he could already see the early morning photography enthusiasts setting up their equipment. Tour buses would soon begin their endless parade, disgorging hundreds of visitors eager for the perfect selfie with a real Queen's Guard. The first group of tourists approached around 10 in the morning. They were polite enough, snapping photos from a respectful distance and whispering among themselves about the guard's impressive stillness. James had learned to find a focal point in the distance and fix his gaze there, letting the world around him blur into background noise. Today, he chose a spot just above the Victoria Memorial, where the morning light caught the bronze angels in a way that reminded him of the stained glass windows in the chapel where he had been married just 2 years earlier. His wife, Sarah, often worried about his job. She knew the physical demands, the way his feet would ache after 8-hour shifts, the headaches that came from wearing the heavy bearskin hat in summer heat. But she also understood his pride in the role. James would come home and tell her stories about the interesting visitors he had observed, always careful not to break any confidentiality rules, but sharing the human moments that made his static job come alive. As the morning progressed, the crowds grew thicker. A school group from Germany arrived, their teacher explaining the history of the guards in accented English while 30 children stared up at James with wide eyes. He could feel their curiosity like a physical presence, but he maintained his composure, remembering his training about becoming one with the architecture, a living statue in service to the crown. By midday, the temperature had risen considerably, and James could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his thick uniform. Summer duty was always the hardest, but guards were trained to handle far worse conditions. During winter shifts, he had stood through snow and freezing rain that left ice crystals on his eyebrows. In comparison, a warm July day was manageable, even if uncomfortable. The crowd around his post had grown to nearly 50 people, a mix of international tourists, local families, and street performers who always gathered near the palace hopping to catch some of the tourist attention. James had learned to tune out most of the chatter, but he couldn't help noticing certain conversations. A young couple from Australia was planning their wedding and discussing whether they wanted to visit the palace on their honeymoon. An elderly man from Canada was telling his grandson about his own military service, using James as an example of discipline and dedication. These moments reminded James why he loved his job despite its challenges. He was part of something larger than himself, a living connection between the present and centuries of British history. Every day, he stood in the same spot where guards had protected monarchs through the reign of Queen Victoria, through 2 world wars, through the changing of the modern age. The uniform he wore was virtually identical to those worn by guards 50 years earlier, and the protocols he followed had been refined through generations of service. Around 2 in the afternoon, James noticed a commotion developing to his left. A group of about 20 young adults, clearly tourists from their clothing and cameras, had formed a semicircle around another guard post about 30 feet away. Their laughter was louder than usual, and their behavior seemed more aggressive than the typical tourist photography session. From his peripheral vision, James could see them getting progressively closer to the other guard, a younger man named Private Davies, whom James had helped train just 8 months earlier. Davies was standing perfectly still, maintaining proper protocol, but the tourists seemed to interpret his stillness as an invitation for increasingly bold behavior. One of the young men in the group stepped forward and began making faces directly in front of Davies, contorting his expression into exaggerated grimaces while his friends laughed and took photos. When Davies didn't react, the tourist grew bolder, starting to wave his hands in front of the guard's face and making loud noises to try to get a response. James felt his jaw tighten slightly, a small break in his own composure. This type of behavior wasn't uncommon, but it always tested his patience. The tourists didn't understand that the guards were real people doing a real job, not animatronic displays created for their entertainment. The lack of respect bothered him, but protocol was clear. Unless directly threatened or given specific orders, he was to maintain his position and let the situation resolve itself. But the situation wasn't resolving. Instead, it was escalating. A young woman from the group had joined the first tourist, and together they began a mock military drill directly in front of Davies, marching back and forth while saluting dramatically and laughing at their own performance. Other tourists nearby had stopped to watch, some looking uncomfortable with the display, but unsure whether they should intervene. James could see Davies' breathing become slightly more controlled, a sign that the young guard was working hard to maintain his composure. The training had prepared them for this type of harassment, but experiencing it in reality was always more difficult than practice sessions in the controlled environment of the training facility. The group's behavior grew more aggressive. One tourist began shouting questions at Davies, demanding that he speak or move. When Davies maintained his silence, the tourists started insulting him, calling him a fake and claiming that real guards would respond to direct challenges. His friends found this hilarious, encouraging him to continue and filming the entire interaction. A few concerned onlookers approached the group, politely asking them to step back and show some respect, but the tourists dismissed them, claiming they were just having fun and not hurting anyone. The dismissal was arrogant and loud, drawing even more attention to the scene and making several families with children move away from the area. James knew that palace security would eventually intervene if the situation continued to escalate, but the response time could vary depending on what else was happening around the extensive palace grounds. Meanwhile, Davies was handling the harassment professionally, but James could see the strain beginning to show in tiny ways that only another guard would notice. The breaking point came when one of the tourists decided to touch Davies' uniform, reaching out to grab at the buttons on his tunic while laughing about wanting a souvenir. Davies couldn't step back without breaking formation, and the tourist interpreted his stillness as permission to continue. Soon, others in the group were reaching toward Davies, treating him like an object rather than a person. This was crossing a serious line. Physical contact with a guard was not only disrespectful but potentially dangerous. The tourists were creating a security situation, and Davies was trapped by protocol in a position where he couldn't defend himself without breaking the very rules that defined his service. James felt something shift inside him. For 6 years, he had followed every protocol perfectly, understanding that his individual actions reflected on the entire institution of the Queen's Guard. He had never spoken to tourists, never broken formation, never allowed personal feelings to override his professional duty. But watching Davies being treated like a tourist attraction rather than a human being doing his job, James began to question whether absolute adherence to protocol was always the right choice. Sometimes, he realized, protecting what the uniform represents might require protecting the person wearing it. The crowd around Davies had grown larger, with more tourists joining in what had become a game of make the guard react. Davies was completely surrounded now, unable to see beyond the circle of people pressing closer to him. His breathing had become noticeably more labored, and James could see that the young guard was beginning to panic beneath his professional exterior. Security was nowhere in sight, and the situation was rapidly moving beyond simple harassment into something that could become dangerous for Davies and the increasingly agitated crowd. James realized that he was witnessing a moment that would define not just Davies' experience, but his own understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The ancient stones of Pallas had witnessed countless moments of history, but rarely had they seen a guard face the choice between centuries of protocol and immediate human compassion. James was about to discover which was stronger, his training or his conscience. James had been taught that a queen's guard exists in a state of controlled suspension, neither fully present in the moment nor completely absent from it. For 6 years, he had mastered this delicate balance, watching the world flow around him while remaining perfectly still at its center. But as he observed the escalating situation with Private Davies, that careful equilibrium began to crumble. The crowd surrounding Davies had grown to nearly 40 people, transforming what started as thoughtless tourist behavior into something approaching a mob mentality. Social media had amplified everything. James could see phones held high, the harassment as entertainment for audiences around the world. Comments and laughing emojis were probably flooding in real time, turning Davies' professional suffering into viral content. A woman with bleached hair had become the ringleader, encouraging others to get closer and make more noise. She was filming everything with professional-grade equipment, suggesting she might be a content creator looking for viral footage. Her followers mimicked her behavior, each trying to outshock the others for camera time. They had no idea they were humiliating a decorated soldier who had served his country with honor for nearly a year. James knew Davies' story because they had served together through the young man's initial training period. Davies had joined the army after losing his father in a factory accident, seeking structure and purpose during the darkest period of his life. He supported his mother and younger sister with his military salary, sending most of his pay home to help with their rent and his sister's university expenses. The same sense of duty that made him an excellent guard also trapped him in this moment, unable to defend himself without betraying everything he had worked to become. The physical contact had escalated beyond grabbing at uniform buttons. Someone was now attempting to lift Davies' rifle for a photo opportunity, while another tourist tried to get his arm around the guard's shoulders for a selfie. Davies couldn't move without either striking a civilian or abandoning his post, both violations that could end his military career and devastate his family's financial stability. James watched Davies' face, noting the micro-expressions that years of shared service had taught him to read. Beneath the professional mask, he could see panic beginning to override training. Davies' eyes had started darting side to side, looking for escape routes or help that weren't coming. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, visible in the slight movement of his tunic's brass buttons. The crowd misinterpreted Davies' obvious distress as part of the entertainment. Someone shouted that they were breaking him down, encouraging others to push harder. A young man started doing jumping jacks directly in front of Davies while screaming military commands he had apparently learned from movies. His girlfriend filmed the performance while making commentary about how uptight British soldiers were compared to Americans. James felt his own carefully controlled composure beginning to fracture. This wasn't harmless fun anymore. This was systematic humiliation of a person who couldn't defend himself, broadcast to thousands of viewers who would never understand the human cost of their entertainment. Every protocol James had been taught told him to maintain position and let the situation resolve through proper channels. But those same protocols were preventing him from protecting a fellow soldier who needed immediate help. The moment that shattered James's restraint came when he saw tears beginning to form in Davies' eyes. The young guard was breaking down in front of 40 strangers who were treating his pain as comedy. Davies had reached the limit of what human dignity could endure while trapped in the rigid requirements of military protocol. James had witnessed many difficult situations during his 6 years of service, but he had never seen another guard cry while on duty. The sight struck him like a physical blow, awakening something deeper than training or tradition. This wasn't about protecting a building or following rules anymore. This was about protecting someone who couldn't protect himself. Without fully realizing he was moving, James took his first step away from his assigned post in over 6 years of service. The movement felt surreal, like breaking through invisible barriers that had defined the boundaries of his world. His feet, so accustomed to remaining planted in one spot for hours, carried him forward with surprising fluidity. The crowd around Davies initially didn't notice James approaching. They were too focused on their victim and their cameras to pay attention to movement from 30 feet away. But as James drew closer, His distinctive silhouette and purposeful stride began attracting attention from tourists who weren't part of the harassment. A Japanese family taking photos near the palace gates noticed him first. The father pointed and said something to his wife in rapid Japanese, his tone suggesting confusion about whether guards were allowed to move during duty hours. An elderly British couple followed his gesture and began whispering to each other, clearly uncertain whether they were witnessing something normal or extraordinary. James reached the outer edge of the crowd surrounding Davies, and his presence began creating a ripple effect. The first few tourists who noticed him stepped back instinctively, unsure what his approach might mean, but recognizing that something significant was happening. Their movement created small gaps in the circle, allowing James to see Davies more clearly. Up close, the young guard's distress was unmistakable. Sweat had beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air, and his hands were trembling slightly where they gripped his rifle. The tears James had spotted from a distance were indeed threatening to fall, held back only by Davies' desperate attempt to maintain some shred of professional dignity. The content creator with the hair finally noticed James and swung her camera toward him, sensing that his arrival might provide even better footage than harassing Davies. She started narrating for her audience, explaining that another guard was breaking character and speculating about whether this was part of some kind of performance. James stopped approximately 6 feet from the inner circle of harassment, close enough that his presence was unmistakable, but not so close that he would immediately violate the physical space protocols that governed interactions between guards and civilians. For a moment, he simply stood there, his imposing figure and traditional uniform creating a stark contrast to the chaotic scene around Davies. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The tourists who had been most aggressively harassing Davies suddenly found themselves confronted with a second guard who was clearly not following the same passive resistance they had come to expect. James's presence changed the dynamic entirely, shifting the balance from one helpless person surrounded by antagonists to two soldiers who might represent unknown capabilities. But James wasn't finished. In a voice that carried the authority of 6 years of military service and the conviction of someone who had reached his moral limit, he spoke his first words to tourists in his entire career as a Queen's Guard. "Step away from the guard immediately." The words cut through the laughter and chatter like a sword through silk. Every conversation stopped. Every phone camera swung toward James. The content creator's professional demeanor faltered as she realized she might be recording something far more serious than tourist entertainment. James's voice had carried the unmistakable tone of command authority, developed through years of military training and natural leadership ability. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it contained an undertone that suggested immediate compliance wasn't optional. Several tourists instinctively stepped back, responding to the authority even before their conscious minds had processed what was happening. The content creator, however, wasn't ready to give up her viral moment. She stepped closer to James, holding her camera at arm's length to capture both guards in the frame. "Are you allowed to talk to us? Isn't this against your rules?" she asked with a smirk, clearly expecting to catch James in a protocol violation that would make her footage even more valuable. James turned his full attention to her, and for the first time in years made direct eye contact with a member of the public. The intensity of his gaze was something the content creator hadn't expected. She had been dealing with Davies, who was trained to look through and past civilians, never directly engaging. But James was looking at her with the focused attention of someone evaluating a potential threat. "My duty is to protect what matters," James said, his voice steady and clear. "Right now, what matters is ensuring that a decorated soldier can do his job without being assaulted by tourists who think someone else's dignity is their entertainment." The word "assaulted" hung in the air like a challenge. Several tourists who had been participating in the harassment suddenly looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing for the first time that their behavior might have legal as well as moral implications. The grabbing, the physical contact, the systematic intimidation. When described in clear terms, it sounded much more serious than having fun with a guard. A middle-aged man from the group stepped forward, apparently trying to de-escalate the situation. "Look, we're just tourists. We didn't mean any harm. Isn't interacting with the guards part of the whole experience?" James turned to address him directly, maintaining the same calm but authoritative tone. The experience you're paying for is the privilege of observing centuries of British military tradition. These guards have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts where they've risked their lives for their country. They don't exist for your amusement. The educational nature of James's response began shifting the crowd's perspective. Some tourists who had been laughing minutes earlier now looked genuinely ashamed. They hadn't considered that the guards were real soldiers with real service records, not costumed performers hired to entertain visitors. But the damage to Davies was already done. The young guard was visibly shaking now, overwhelmed by the combination of harassment and the surreal experience of hearing another guard break protocol to defend him. Years of training had prepared him for many situations, but not for this strange combination of humiliation and rescue. James recognized that Davies needed immediate relief from the public eye. Still maintaining his authoritative bearing, he addressed the entire crowd with unmistakable finality. "This demonstration is over. I need all of you to move to the main tourist viewing areas immediately. Anyone who continues to interfere with guard operations will be dealing with palace security within the next 2 minutes." As if summoned by his words, 2 palace security officers appeared at the edge of the crowd, apparently alerted by tourists who had reported the unusual situation. Their arrival provided official backing to James's instructions, and the crowd began dispersing with remarkable speed. The content creator lingered, still filming, but one of the security officers approached her directly and quietly explained the legal implications of continuing to record what was now classified as a security intervention. As the tourists scattered, James found himself alone with Davies for the first time since the ordeal had begun. The young guard was struggling to regain his composure, clearly embarrassed by his emotional breakdown, but also profoundly grateful for the intervention. James had approximately 30 seconds before his unauthorized departure from his post would be noticed by official channels. In that brief window, he needed to ensure Davies could continue his duty and return to his own position before the full weight of military protocol came down on both of them. "Davies," he said quietly, using the guard's name for the first time in an official capacity. "You handled that correctly. Never let anyone make you think otherwise." Davies nodded, unable to speak, but conveying his gratitude through eye contact that said everything words couldn't express. James had given him something invaluable, the knowledge that someone had witnessed his ordeal and judged him not weak for struggling, but strong for enduring. But even as James began to return to his post, both guards knew that the consequences of the next few minutes would extend far beyond this single afternoon. James had exactly 47 steps to return to his post before his absence would trigger an official incident report. As he walked back across the palace courtyard, each step felt weighted with the magnitude of what he had just done. 6 years of perfect service, 3 commendations for exemplary conduct, and an unblemished record were now in jeopardy because he had chosen compassion over protocol. The tourists who remained in the area watched him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Word of the intervention was already spreading through social media, but the tone had shifted dramatically from the original harassment footage. Comments were pouring in defending the guards and criticizing the tourists' behavior. The content creator's viral moment hadn't turned out quite as she had planned. James resumed his position with the same precision he had maintained for years, but everything felt different now. The weight of his uniform seemed heavier, not because of physical burden, but because of what it represented after his unprecedented break from protocol. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no way to predict how military command would respond. Within minutes, Sergeant Major Harrison appeared in the courtyard, his brisk pace and serious expression indicating that word of the incident had already reached the command structure. Harrison was a 20-year veteran who had served under 3 different monarchs and seen every possible variation of guard duty complications. His approval or disapproval would largely determine James's fate. Harrison approached Davies first, conducting a brief but thorough assessment of the young guard's condition and readiness to continue duty. Davies had recovered his composure remarkably well, drawing on the same resilience that had carried him through initial training. He answered Harrison's questions with military precision, making it clear that he could complete his shift without further incident. Then Harrison turned toward James, their eyes meeting across 30 feet of historic cobblestone. The sergeant major's expression was unreadable, trained through decades of military service to reveal nothing until he chose to speak. James maintained his forward gaze, following protocol even as he awaited judgment for breaking it. Harrison's approach took exactly 15 measured steps, each one extending the tension until he stopped directly in front of James's position. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The sergeant major studied James with the thoroughness of someone evaluating both a disciplinary problem and a soldier's character under pressure. "Private," Harrison said finally, his voice carrying the authority of rank but lacking the harsh edge that would indicate immediate punishment. "I understand there was an irregular situation requiring intervention." James faced a critical decision about how to respond. Military protocol dictated that he should admit his violation of standing orders and accept whatever punishment followed. But something in Harrison's tone suggested that the situation might be more complex than a simple breach of discipline. "Yes, Sergeant Major," James replied, maintaining proper military bearing. "I left my post to assist Private Davies when tourist harassment escalated beyond acceptable parameters." Harrison nodded slowly, processing the response. "I've received multiple witness reports describing the incident. Several tourists have also approached palace security to apologize for their group's behavior and to commend your intervention. That's unusual." The pause in Harrison's statement hung between them, filled with unspoken evaluation of precedent, protocol, and the human elements that sometimes made rigid rules inadequate for complex situations. James could sense that his fate hinged on factors beyond simple rule-following or rule-breaking. "Private, in your 6 years of service, have you ever left your post without authorization?" "No, Sergeant Major, this was the first time." "Have you ever spoken to tourists while on duty?" "No, Sergeant Major, not until today." Harrison walked slowly around James's position, observing him from multiple angles as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The inspection felt different from routine evaluations, more like an assessment of character than compliance with regulations. "What you did today violated several standing orders," Harrison said, his voice maintaining official neutrality. "Leaving your post, engaging with civilians, intervening in situations outside your immediate responsibility. Under normal circumstances, these violations would result in formal disciplinary action and possible reassignment." James felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. He had known the risks when he chose to act, and he was prepared to accept the consequences. His career might be over, but Davies was safe, and that mattered more than any personal cost. But Harrison wasn't finished. "However," the sergeant major continued, "the circumstances were not normal. Private Davies was being subjected to behavior that crossed the line from tourism into harassment and potential assault. Palace security was not immediately available, and the situation was escalating beyond what any individual guard should be expected to endure alone." James felt a flicker of hope, but he remained cautious. Military discipline could be unpredictable, and favorable initial reactions didn't always translate into official pardons. Harrison stopped directly in front of James again, this time speaking in a tone that carried personal rather than purely official weight. "I've been a guard for 20 years. I've seen tourists push boundaries, test limits, and sometimes cross lines. But I've never seen anything quite like what happened to Davies today, and I've never seen another guard handle such a situation with the judgment you demonstrated." The unexpected praise left James uncertain how to respond. Military training had prepared him for criticism, punishment, and correction, but not for commendation following a clear violation of orders. "Your primary duty is to protect what matters," Harrison continued, echoing James's own words to the tourists. "Today, what mattered was protecting a fellow soldier's safety and dignity. You made a difficult choice under pressure, and you made it correctly." James felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly broke his military bearing. But Harrison's next words reminded him that the situation still carried serious implications. "However, this incident will require a full report to commanding officers. Your actions will be reviewed at levels above my authority. I can recommend no disciplinary action, but I cannot guarantee that recommendation will be accepted." The uncertainty was perhaps worse than outright punishment would have been. James would have to wait, possibly for weeks, while officers who hadn't witnessed the situation evaluated his choices from the safety of offices far removed from the tourist-filled courtyard where real decisions had to be made in real time. Over the following days, the incident took on a life of its own far beyond the palace walls. The footage shot by tourists and the content creator had spread across multiple social media platforms, but the narrative had evolved dramatically from the original intention. Instead of mocking the guards, viewers were praising James's intervention and criticizing the tourists' behavior. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of human decency overriding rigid bureaucracy. Military experts were interviewed about the balance between protocol and practical judgment. Tourism authorities issued statements reminding visitors that guards were active military personnel deserving of respect. Sarah watched her husband navigate the unexpected attention with characteristic grace, but she could see the stress of uncertainty wearing on him. James had always been proud of his perfect service record, and the possibility that his career might end due to one moment of human compassion weighed heavily on his mind. The official review took 2 weeks. During that time, James continued his regular duties while military investigators interviewed witnesses, reviewed footage, and consulted precedent for similar situations. Davies provided a detailed statement describing the escalation of tourist harassment and crediting James's intervention with preventing a potentially dangerous situation. The palace also received an unprecedented volume of correspondence from the public supporting James's actions. Letters arrived from military veterans, British citizens, and international visitors who had seen the footage and wanted to express their approval of his judgment. Several tourists who had witnessed the incident but weren't directly involved sent written statements corroborating the severity of the harassment Davies had endured. When the review concluded, James was summoned to a formal hearing attended by officers he had never met, men whose ranks and responsibilities extended far beyond palace guard duty. The room felt imposing, filled with the weight of military history and the certainty that careers could end or continue based on decisions made within its walls. Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer overseeing the hearing, had served in multiple conflicts and understood the complexity of balancing rules with practical reality. His opening statement set a tone that surprised everyone present. "Private, we are here to review an incident in which you violated multiple standing orders while on duty at Palace. Under normal military protocol, such violations would result in formal censure and possible discharge from service." James prepared himself for the worst, drawing on the same stoic acceptance that had carried him through years of guard duty. "However," Colonel Richardson continued, "this review has determined that your violations occurred in service of a higher duty, the protection of a fellow soldier under circumstances that existing protocols had not adequately addressed." The room was silent, except for the scratching of pens recording the proceedings for official records. "Your actions demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and moral courage that this service seeks to develop in its members. You identified a situation where rigid adherence to protocol was creating rather than preventing harm, and you chose to prioritize the welfare of a fellow soldier over personal safety." James felt his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't express in the formal setting. "Therefore, this review finds no grounds for disciplinary action. Furthermore, your service record will reflect a commendation for exceptional judgment under pressure." The words took several seconds to register fully. Not only was James avoiding punishment, but he was being officially praised for the same actions that could have ended his career. Colonel Richardson continued with the practical implications. "However, this incident has highlighted gaps in our protocols for handling civilian harassment of guards. You will be working with command staff to develop new guidelines for situations where tourist behavior crosses acceptable boundaries." The assignment meant that James's moment of protocol violation would become part of official training, helping future guards navigate similar challenges with clearer guidance than he had possessed. When James returned to his post the following week, everything felt different yet somehow more authentic. The tourists still came, cameras still flashed, and the ancient rhythms of palace guard duty continued unchanged. But now James carried the knowledge that the institution he served was capable of growth, of recognizing that human judgment sometimes transcended written rules. Davies approached him during a shift change, still somewhat shy about the incident but deeply grateful for the intervention that had changed both their careers in unexpected ways. "I never thanked you properly," Davies said quietly. "What you did that day, it saved me in more ways than you know." James clapped him on the shoulder in the brief moment before they had to resume official bearing. "We look after each other. That's what the uniform really means." Months later, when James would tell the story to new guards during training sessions, he would emphasize that real military bearing wasn't about blind obedience to rules, but about understanding when those rules served their intended purpose and when they didn't. The tourists still took photos, but they did so with notably more respect, often remarking to each other about the professionalism and humanity they had witnessed in viral footage of one guard's moment of courageous compassion. James had learned that sometimes breaking protocol was the most military thing you could do, and that the best traditions were strong enough to evolve when confronted with the complexities of real human experience. The red tunic and bearskin hat still represented centuries of British military heritage, but now they also represented something equally important: the understanding that duty to country includes duty to the people who serve beside you, regardless of what the rule book says about staying perfectly still.